The distinction between so-called liberal and conservative Catholicism still shapes how many people today see the Church. Liberal Catholics, we're told, dream of a synodal church. They talk about accompaniment. They're progressive on social and moral issues. They're waiting for Vatican II. Conservative Catholics, by contrast, are said to prioritize personal holiness over social action. They read the Catechism. They challenge supposed excesses in the interpretation of the Council. They want to reform its reforms. On this picture, the Church looks pretty divided. Today, I want to recast this picture and look at it in a new way. Really, I just want to share with you an idea that came to me when I was working on my dissertation. I have been sitting with it for a long while, and I will be very keen to hear your thoughts. My claim will be this, that so-called liberal and conservative Catholics have far more in common than we might think they do. And I don't just mean because they're both Catholic. Right? What they have in common is that both, as distinct camps, have been shaped by and even arisen from a movement known as personalism. We can recognize people in both of these camps as personalists. That's my claim, whether they use the term or not. But they're personalists in different and sometimes incompatible ways. Now, if this is right, then we have a tale of two personalisms, as Callie announced the title for the paper, rather than a debate between liberals and conservatives. And that's my claim. So in passing, we can set this claim in relief by noting that both of these camps, so-called liberal and conservative Catholics, are distinct from a third camp, Catholic traditionalists, as represented by Society of St. Pius X and certain voices in Catholic social media. Both so-called liberals and conservatives are distinct from this third camp, I argue, because they both accept personalism, as taught by Vatican II with its emphasis on the dignity of the person, primacy of individual conscience. Traditionalists reject personalism, and largely for that reason, they also reject the Council. We won't be able to explore that today, but I wanted to put that up. So if my overall claim is right, then we can indeed look at things in a new way. The lines that divide us are not drawn between people who are liberal, conservative, and really conservative, right? We're dealing, rather, with a dispute over how to understand the human person. At bottom, that is a philosophical problem. It is not a political problem. So to develop this claim, I'll do a few things. First, I want to answer the question, what is personalism? It's clearly important. Then I'll identify two red threads running through the personalist movement, one leading to so-called liberal Catholicism and the other to so-called conservative. Finally, I'll say a bit about how these two varieties of personalism seem to have informed the Council, and I'll draw some practical conclusions. So, what is personalism? For our purposes, we can say that personalism is a movement in philosophy that accords preeminence to the human person and to personal experience. Personalists like to talk about the whole human person, like our marketing departments, right? We educate the whole human. Where do you think that came from? Where did it come from? It came from here, right? They challenge impersonal systems of thought and social organization. We're not a cog in the machine, right? They champion a basic distinction between person and thing. This all being said, personalism is hard to trace as a real existing historical movement. Jacques Maritain once complained that there seem to be as many personalisms as there are personalists. In the early 20th century, distinct schools of personalism arose, at least in Germany, in France, the UK, and the United States, where notably in the US it influenced Martin Luther King Jr. At Boston University. There was a school, the Boston Personalist. To understand all this better, let's though look at some history. It will not be news to us that the Catholic Church, since 1789, God bless you, and throughout the 19th century, saw itself as engaged in a kind of mortal combat with the modern world. Emblematic is Pius's Syllabus of Errors, 1864. Also, I think though more constructively, Leo's Aeterni Patris in 1879, which identified the work of Thomas Aquinas called Thomism, that's the term I'll be using, as offering the philosophical approach best able to serve as an alternative to modern ways of thinking. And indeed, these modern ways of thinking, by which I mean developments in modern philosophy, were as concerning to many Catholics as any political events at this time, right? Why? Why were people so concerned about philosophy? Well, on the standard story, the problems in modern philosophy were traceable to two people, René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, right? You saw that coming. Okay. Descartes had made his cogito, I think, right, the basis of all knowledge. And so he introduced, it said, modern individualism. We're atomized, we're disembodied. Kant, in his turn, had argued that we can't know things as they are in themselves. We can only know them as they appear to us. So he gave us modern subjectivism. Now, individualism and subjectivism were thought to be both bad and false. Right? Descartes and Kant got blamed for this. They had treated human beings as isolated individuals who could have no objective knowledge of the world. And this was thought to have driven all the political convulsions of the period. Now, by the 1910s, as the long 19th century drew to a close, some Catholics felt that the fortress mentality, long characteristic of their relation to the modern world, was not sustainable. Change was needed, right? And indeed it came. In subsequent decades, we had the liturgical movement, we had nouvelle theologie. Eventually we had the council itself, and we also had personalism, right? So that movement was one of these responses. If Descartes and Kant had caused the problems in modern philosophy, personalists thought that two other people could solve them. The first person was Max Scheler, the bombastic, chain-smoking German phenomenologist and sometime Catholic, who from 1913 to 16 developed the first thoroughgoing expression of a personalist philosophy explicitly. So in the book where he does this, he engages mostly with Kant, both for and against. Against Kant, in short, we can't get into the details of it, Scheler held that we can have knowledge of the real world, including objective knowledge of ethical values and aesthetic values. Catholic thinkers liked that. And yet, Scheler also made some concessions to Kant. He conceded, most importantly, that this objective knowledge that he's holding out can be attained only through subjective experience, right? So the perceiving individual subject remained central to the whole picture in good modern style. That looked like subjectivism, right? And some Catholic thinkers didn't much like it. We'll get back to Scheler in a moment. The second person the personalists looked to was the German Jewish thinker Martin Buber. In 1923, Buber's I and Thou took the Catholic world by storm, and that is not an overstatement. Everyone was talking about that book, and remarkably, we still are. Encounter. Where do you think we got that, right? Okay. Pope Francis referred to Buber recently. I think it was Fratelli Tutti. Literally cited Martin Buber. It's amazing. Okay. In this book, I and Thou, Buber distinguishes between two kinds of relationships. One he calls an I-thou relationship. So he's intentionally using the older familiar form of the second person, right? The thou, right? In an I-thou relationship in which one person encounters another person in a deep and self-constituting way. The other relationship he calls an I-it relationship. And there, a person merely interacts with a thing, right? An object. Coming on the heels of Scheler's work, Buber's book gave Catholic thinkers the crucial missing piece they needed to mount their challenge against modern philosophy. It gave them a compelling alternative to Descartes. For in Buber's view, persons are not isolated, atomized individuals. They're made persons only by their encounters with other persons. No one is an island, no one is alone, and so forth. Okay, the two personalisms. Happily, the stage is set now to describe the two personalisms referred to in my title. I should clarify that I mean by this two distinct takes on personalism, right, or varieties. If we're being honest, these are really two ideal types in the good old Weber sense. I'll identify each type in the work of a single author, but I don't mean to say that the work of that author is utterly singular, right? It's just the clearest instance of the type as I see it. So, the first variety of personalism is the one I want to connect with so-called liberal Catholicism. It's due most directly to Emmanuel Mounier, the French writer and activist, founder of the journal Esprit. Initially inspired by Scheler and Buber, Mounier set out to build an intellectual and political movement with his journal at the center of it. He called it personalist communitarianism, but he said, since that's a mouthful and no one's going to say it, I'll just call it personalism. So it's implicitly personalist communitarianism. John Hellman, an historian at McGill University, has identified this movement and Mounier as the source, the fons et origo, of what was later called the Catholic left. His biography of Mounier is called Emmanuel Mounier and the New Catholic Left. That's significant. In his written work, Mounier draws extensively on Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. He wrote a whole book on Nietzsche. He challenges conventional, he calls them bourgeois values. He calls for a more active, justice-oriented Catholicism that is open to the future. He's big on technology, for example. In all this, he saw himself as channeling Charles Péguy, the earlier poet and journalist who had worked to reconcile Christianity with socialism. In 1936, Mounier published a full statement of his platform called a Personalist Manifesto. Notably, this drew the attention of Peter Maurin at the Catholic Worker, who was reading this stuff in French, right? Maurin arranged for Mounier's book to be translated and published by the monks at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, and he and Dorothy Day thereafter identified, quote, the personalist communitarianism of Emmanuel Mounier as the guiding philosophy of the Catholic worker movement. As late as 1976, Dorothy Day in a personal letter says, as you know, all these years we've been doing Mounier. Remarkable. The defining feature of Mounier's personalism for our purposes is this. He follows Scheler in affirming the essentially subjective, that is, non-objective nature of the person. The person is not an object. The person is not an individual substance of a rational nature, as Boethius and Thomas Aquinas used to say, right? The person is indeed not a substance at all. She's not bound by any fixed objective features that are just given, right? The person is an event. The person is a movement. And here Mounier is close to existentialism. 1950, he wrote the following, some words from him, right? The essence of the person is indefinable. It is not some internal substratum, substance lurking beneath our attitudes. That would still be a mode of being objective, right? A person is the living activity of self-creation, of communication and attachment, that grasps and knows itself in the act as the movement of becoming personal. Close quote. For Mounier, then, no person can be fully a person if she is defined, labeled, right? If she's put in the mode of this objective. And there's a practical consequence here, because we can build this personalist and communitarian civilization only if we're open to surprising, uncharted, ever-new encounters with others, if we're open to this living activity of self-creation, right? This is where the spirit moves. We need to create these spaces. Mounier's personalism seems to me to have had effects in many areas of Catholic thought and practice. It fits with the Catholic worker especially clearly. I've had opportunities to visit several worker communities, and I am always struck by the utter unpredictability of these communities. They're startling, but also their startling intimacy, their fecundity, their closeness. Everybody's just encountering each other everywhere. And we might mention a few other possible connections just in passing. Think of Pope Francis, right? He likes to make a mess. He wants to walk with you, accompany you, find out where you're at, right? He wants to be open to that work of the Spirit. His chapter on the Good Samaritan parable in Fratelli Tutti reads to me like a study in Mounier's personalism, right? I just come upon this man on the road. I respond in the moment, right? There's this spontaneity about it. Think also in liturgy, maybe, about the novus ordo itself, right? The real presence is affirmed amidst the assembly, right? Here, not beyond it. The celebration ad populum, not ad orientem, off to the east, right? The Spirit is here now. It's not off on the horizon, right? The kingdom is here now. But be that all as it may, for now I just want to restate my claim. In Mounier's personalism, we have a taproot of liberal Catholicism, so-called. Okay, the second variety of personalism is the one I want to connect to so-called conservative Catholicism. And it's due most directly to Karol Wojtyła, who was elected as Pope John Paul II in 1979. So Wojtyła wrote his doctoral dissertation on St. John the Cross. When that was done, he was encouraged by his advisor, Garrigou Lagrange, the Thomist, to write on Max Scheler for his habilitation, second dissertation. The question would be simple. Can Scheler's personalism be the basis of a Christian ethics? Can Scheler's personalism be the basis of a Christian ethics? Wojtyła thought that Thomism, which was the preeminent philosophy at the time, lacked the resources to articulate an anthropology. Thomism could not compellingly answer the question, what is man, for a modern audience? This was a problem, Wojtyła thought, and he thought that the church needed an answer to this question, and he thought Scheler maybe could offer that solution. The conclusion of the study, though, spoiler, is no. It cannot offer that solution. Scheler's personalism could not be the basis of a Christian ethics, Wojtyła concludes. Why? 2 reasons. First, he was concerned that Scheler made the objectivity of values and ethics, right, dependent on subjective experience. We had to go through the affect, the emotion, the experience of the individual. This seemed slippery to him. This seemed dangerous. Second, he felt that Scheler's account of ethical agency wasn't enough, wasn't adequate. The person seemed to be kind of swept about by her subjective experiences, just acting out her affects, right? And never fully accountable, never the originator of her actions. These were the 2 deficiencies that he saw in Scheler's work. So he closed the book on Scheler, but not for long. In 1960, just a few years later, he took a step to launch the project that would define his philosophical career. He delivered a paper to acclaim under the title Thomistic Personalism. Thomistic Personalism. His title indicates the shape of the project. While personalism could not on its own be the basis of a Christian ethics, it could serve that function, Wojtyła thought, if it were integrated with Thomism. Thomism plus personalism. Thomism could supply the elements that Scheler's personalism lacked. It could give a truly objective account of the person and of ethics. It could give a full account of ethical agency. Starting from that paper, Wojtyła went on to develop his own personalism, notably in Love and Responsibility, that same year, 1960, and in his magnum opus, Person and Act. What a story about that book, 1969. That's fascinating. One could also include his Wednesday audiences delivered as Pope from 79 to 84, where he developed what came to be called his theology of the body. For Wojtyła then, concluding this, unlike Mounier, just this section, the person precisely is defined for John Paul II, for Wojtyła, right? Phenomenologically and informed by Thomism, we can discern objective features of ourselves, our nature as persons, right? Objective features of our acts, intrinsic qualities of ethical actions. Spontaneity and encounter are important, but they're not everything, right? Because the person is not just a movement for Wojtyła. The person has substance, substantial features, right? An individual substance of a rational nature. To discern our vocation and live a holy life, Wojtyła thinks, in order to be a saint, we need to recognize these features of ourselves and our actions. So here we have then our second variety, which I'll call the taproot of conservative Catholicism, so-called. Okay. So the council. Let's say just a bit about personalism at the council. Pope Emeritus Benedict, in his last Testament, 2016 book, describes how personalism affected his own thinking at the time of the council. We need to leave most of that aside, unfortunately, right? But it's worth quoting him and his characterization of his own aims at the time of the council and the atmosphere that he experienced there. So a quote from Pope Emeritus Benedict. I wanted to understand the theological thinkers of the Middle Ages and modernity in a new way, he writes, and then to proceed from this. This is where personalism, he writes, which was in the air at that time, particularly struck me and seemed to be the right starting point of both philosophical and theological thought. Close quote. It would seem that others at the council were also reading these signs of the times. References to the human person are famously prominent in Gaudium et Spes, especially Chapter 1, Dignity of the Human Person, Chapter 2, Community of Man. A connection may also be drawn with the ecclesiology of Lumen Gentium, especially in Chapter 2 of that document. The church is not an impersonal institution, right? It is indeed itself a people. The church is a people. It is the people of God. Neither this constitution nor the other documents of the council refer to Scheler or Buber or Mounier explicitly, of course, but it's not necessary for my argument that they should. What's needed is only this: the fact that at the council, personalism was, quote, in the air. It was a serious and active concern for several luminaries there, including Wojtyła, and the language of person and community was given robust expression in the most prominent places of the Council's most prominent documents. There is much more we could say here, of course, but that's for another time. So, conclusion. I've said that these personalisms are destined to be in tension. Why? I propose it comes down to one thing: objective characteristics of the person and of acts. Do persons and acts have objective features to which we are ethically beholden, or do they not? Beyond dialogue, beyond encounter, beyond experience, beyond perception, are there objective features of things? Mounier's personalism eschews any such limitations on the self-creativity of the person. For him, existence precedes essence. Practice precedes theory. Right? The spirit needs some open space in which to work. On the other hand, Wojtyła's personalism positively insists upon such limitations. Male and female, he created them. So clearly there is a tension between these two outlooks, and that tension will continue to be a problem if I'm right that these outlooks influence broad swaths of the church today. But that's not the worst of it. For not only is there tension between these personalisms, Mounier's and Wojtyła's, but there are tensions resulting from the attempted mixture of personalism and Thomism. This is clearly evident in certain church teachings. Take Humanae Vitae, for example. Right? So here, you're blending a Thomist argument, the assertion that using condoms is as an act intrinsically evil, and a personalist argument that the use of contraception on a broad societal scale will result in the emergence of a contraceptive mentality, right? Transform the culture. It's confusing. Which one is it? What's the problem, right? People had complained about that at the time. Or take the case, and this is the clincher, take the case of sexual acts engaged in between persons of the same sex. These acts are objectively disordered. That is a Thomist argument. It's about the objective nature of the act, right? Yet, since the 1970s, we've also taught that persons who experience same-sex attraction are not for that reason alone sinful. They should be treated with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Building a bridge, James Martin, right? Okay. That's a personalist argument. But who can live with this tension? Not LGBT Catholics, right? In both of these cases, we find what seems to me an untenable blend of Thomism and personalism. It's awkward. And Peter Kraft, characteristically, gives it an awkward name, the awkward name it deserves. He calls it Thomersonalism. In a wonderful article, he called it Thomersonalism, right? So here's my view. We need to face this awkwardness, and not just pastorally or politically, we need to face it philosophically, because it is a philosophical problem. How to understand the human person. I've mentioned contraception and same-sex attraction, but what about transgender identity? Huh, everybody? What resources do we have to address that philosophically in the context of church teaching? Right? To me, the document released last June by the Congregation for Education suggests that we have precisely none. None. And that is a problem. It will become a bigger problem presently. So we can begin to address and resolve these tensions only once we realize that we are personalists. There's a name for our outlook here, right? And only once we realize that our personalism, of whatever variety, so-called liberal, conservative, whatever, is in tension with the Thomistic content of these and other consequential church teachings. Only when we realize these things can we answer the question that really needs answering: what kind of personalists will we be? Thank you.